Forgive me, I have a cold, so it might be a little unclear. So I guess if Parfit's is about this question being a decent question, Bergson's very much about that question being an indecent question. The way he goes about this in the paper is by focusing on two theoretical illusions in order to clear them up and define by contrast a philosophy that sees duration in the stuff of reality. The first illusion is basically our inability to see true reality. Because we have, a conceptual faculty of a certain nature, we have senses of a certain nature, we essentially get snapshots of reality. That's the way that we think as we go through life. Whereas this is not, in fact, what reality really is. Reality is either becoming or, making itself or unmaking itself. So even when we think of memories, they're still snapshots of past moments in times, things like that. So we can never grasp this true reality. The second illusion is that we transfer a procedure which is meant for action, and we transfer this procedure to speculation incorrectly, Bergson is implying. So the first thing he does is he references an example I presume he gave earlier in his work about order and disorder, and how, for example, we say in one sense, a room, we go into it and it's a mess, right? So it's in disorder. So he's saying that that's basically, it's in disorder, but only in reference to something that we had in mind, which was it being tidy. So what he's trying to clear up with this is that you don't go into that messy room and there are no laws of nature. There is still order in the grander scale, just not in this referential scale of how we expected the room to be, hence tidy. So yeah, he uses that to then kind of launch into this concept of the naught, which he says is at the root of all of the most tortuous problems in philosophy, and it definitely resonated with me, and it's very much akin to this Parfit question that's come up. So the kind of questions that come up from this idea of the naught, or the problem of the naught, is why I exist, and if you go further than that, why the universe exists, which is Parfit's question. And even if, say, you believe that there was something before that, whether it be a creative force or a god or whatever, why does that exist? The question still prevails. And even if you go with the idea of, existence having always been, then, why is there that rather than nothing? It's still just this annoying problem that seems to persist throughout philosophy. And he basically explains it as this tendency we have to think of existence as a conquest over nothing. So first there is nothing, and then there's being. That's the way we tend to think about it. Or that something has always existed, but it's like in a receptacle. It's like water filling a glass, it's something filling a void. This is the way that we tend to naturally think about this problem. And these are all, as he goes on to explain, very incorrect ways of thinking about it. So he references, typical metaphysics, which gives the logical realm this kind of eternal existence, but not the physical or the psychological. So things like the axiom A is A, that's something that persists throughout all of time, throughout all of existence, and we feel quite comfortable with that idea. And yet the idea of existence doing the same thing is very uncomfortable to most people, most metaphysicians. So what he kind of sets up in this is that if we can prove that opposing existence is a pseudo-idea, then all of these problems that we've just been talking about are pseudo-problems. We don't need to worry about them. And it allows for an intuitive philosophy which doesn't sacrifice common sense. So, yeah, if nothing is imagined or conceived, so nothing itself, the concept, is imagined or conceived, and he then starts to go through these descriptions of what that would actually be, because it's very important to realize what we're actually doing when we're thinking or imagining or conceiving of nothing. So firstly, he has the image of it, which he runs through the process of, and by trying to get an image of nothing, there's a process where we start to first strip all of the senses that we have, so that we have none of these different sensory information coming in. And then we try to do this kind of internal blanking out as well. And what he comes through his argument is that it's impossible to do both, because as soon as you do one, then you're left with the other. So either one implies the presence of the other. And then if we think of nothingness as the idea of nothing, which he references Descartes' thousand-sided polygon, which is something that we have to conceptually kind of imagine the idea of, but we can't necessarily see. So if we take that same process of thinking, we've got a certain number-sided object and we can extrapolate out a much bigger one. If we do that with annihilation, so we imagine first annihilating one object, then another, and then so on, and doing that ad infinitum, then that's the process we imagine coming to nothing. But in doing that, it just becomes a word, because you can't annihilate everything in itself. It's kind of self-defeating. And this is kind of like his overall picture of starting to talk about the circular nature of annihilation, of how you try and annihilate something and then something else is there. That's what happens in existence. So some examples he gives of this, this is moving on to sort of like the internal side of it, which is a dreamless sleep, which you could use as a reference of, this is me experiencing nothing. But when you actually think about that, you think of yourself almost watching yourself in a dreamless sleep. It's still a thing going on. If you imagine, annihilating yourself, you're still there, sort of, as you've been annihilated, you're still imagining it, and it's kind of persisting. So essentially what he's going on, which I think he did quite well, maybe I'm not arguing it in the best way, but it's that proof of the absurdity of this and how it does just become a word. So then he moves from this kind of factual side to the thought side, saying that, if we go with the idea that something exists and we just blot it out, we just strike it out from existence, by doing that, we posit, by contrast, the existence of the real in general. So I think there was quite a good example he used of a table is not white, which itself, it requires the expectation of something. So if you imagine yourself as a being that doesn't have any expectations, or so it's just something that just sees things as they are, then when you come to this object, you will just see whatever is there, not the absence of a white table. So, yeah, it's almost like whenever you say that, like, something is not, so the table is not white, you're almost answering an interlocutor, someone you're talking to, either yourself or externally, who's saying, there is a white table, and you're basically saying that there is no white table. But the saying of there is no white table assumes the presence of something else. Just you've given it no content in this situation yet. So it's kind of a part of a process. And yeah, so that's kind of the difference between you have this being that experiences pure reality and just goes through, experiencing things, and then the way that we do it in terms of this, of, just making a judgment of a judgment, rather than seeing something as it actually is. And And the reasons he gives for this, which he expands upon later, are the pedagogical and social kind of nature of how we go about thinking about things. Yeah, so there was another example around the ground is not damp. And yeah, and even that itself, to say the ground is not damp, presupposes that you have experienced dryness in order to know that this is not that. It's the dampness, so that you've not experienced that. So yeah, you must have the belief that the ground might be damp, and that this dampness has been replaced by quality X, whatever that happens to be. Yeah, then he goes on to talk about negation's subjective character, in that it takes account of what's been replaced, but not what replaces it. And he uses an example of, it's like a traveller who looks out the back of a carriage and only knows where he's left, never the position he's actually in, if that makes sense. Yeah, so again, he references again this mind that sees pure reality, true reality, seeing the existence of things in the present without to this being there is no void, no negation, partial or relative. It just sees things as they are. The concept of nothing doesn't have any reference point for this being. Then he goes through a process of how we might take this being, which sees pure existence, and take it to our more faulty view through a series of stages of adding, certain beliefs and certain desires onto it, and then he kind of finishes that section by saying that when you obtain the idea of the absolute nothing, it is in fact a comprehensive and full idea, which is this, in nature of the all. And so, in a sense, it is a pseudo idea. He kind of comes to that conclusion through all of this, and it does still haunt our mind because of the nature of what kind of being we are. But it is a pseudo idea, and therefore all of the problems that arise are pseudo problems. So he finishes off by running down through all of the points. The circular nature of annihilation, always because it's always being replaced by something. Non-existence as the expulsion of the merely possible existence by a more substantial existence of true reality, and the negation as judgment of a judgment. With power to create ideas, but without the content required to do so. And so basically the illusion of annihilation is self-destructive, and if it is just a word, then there is as much in the idea of nothing as in the all.
Great, thank you very much. People's thoughts.
I have a question, but I don't know if it really makes sense because it is connected to the idea of space and time. If we think about the circular nature of annihilation, by that I mean that we have X, we think of not X, and we can go on backwards in this infinite chain. But if we think about an infinite chain, I think we have two main possibilities about space and time, which is thinking of the world as eternal, so we can go backwards forever. So this circular nature of annihilation doesn't make doesn't raise any problem. Or we have to think about a point zero from which everything started, which is basically the idea of creation provided by the Bible. So that was my question, if the idea of time, the idea of time that Bergson has comes from this or not.
I think he goes for the first option. I think he thinks of time as infinite, but with a qualification, because as we've seen, he has his general suspicions about the intellect, and to think of time as infinite backwards in terms of quantity, that's, at the end of the day for him, that's not the right way to think about things.
Okay, but if we think about space, because if we cannot really think about a void, I mean, if I have a box and then in my mind, or physically, I remove this box, I still have the space where the box was, which is where I see it as a void, but I still see like the borders of this box. So does that mean that space itself is infinite as well, or?
Good. Okay, that's a very good question for Bergson. Again, no complications because he doesn't believe in the full reality of space, but hold those aside. So, what's Bergson's reply to that?
So say the question.
So the thought is that it seems that we can remove space and all of its contents, if this is right, and suppose that space and all of its contents is then absent from something. So we want to say, or we need to say, the box is now empty, if this is right. It doesn't any longer have the world and space in it. So don't we have a concept of the naught, nothingness?
Oh, so this box has gone from, that has nothing in it, right?
Yeah, it's now the vacuum.
But when you say vacuum, what do you mean? Because, like, for example, he uses an example about the, was it a room where he goes into with his, he shows his friend and he says, there's nothing in this room. But when we say all of these things, it's in terms of utility. So when we say there's nothing in this room, we mean in terms of, like, there's nothing to sit on and so on. But there's still a room full of air.
Yeah.
You know, it's still, there's existence in this room, which I guess would be the same thing with this box, right?
Right. Okay, so is that an effective answer to your question, or does your question still stand, do you think?
No, my question was I understand what he says about the impossibility of a void, of an actual void. My question was mainly on I was actually stressing the point that there is no void, because even if you think of an empty of removing a box, we still have the idea of space. So.
Oh, I see. Okay, fine. Well, so it's not. Sorry, so it's not a point against Bergson.
No, it's not.
No.
Sorry, I probably.
Mine.
Sorry, my mistake.
Okay, so we've got one agreement, Jack.
Is he saying that the idea of a void is unimaginable, or that it's not possible?
Well, I think it's not saying that a void or strictly nothingness, the naught, it's not saying that it is metaphysically impossible, because it wants to get behind, it wants to go a step back and say that the question of possibility and impossibility doesn't properly arise. Okay, so that's why it's not a solution, but it's a solution to the problem that says that it's a pseudo problem. Yeah.
So he's taking out the metaphysics and then he's talking about it like a physical thing. Something about that just seems really wrong to me.
It's not physical, it's all about your concept of it.
Okay, well, at the same time, it seems like your perspective on what nothing is still seems like flawed.
I think he's just saying that he dissolves the basis on which you ask questions like why anything. It's based on a conceptual misunderstanding of nothing. In the sense that it's a sort of a rational antithesis to existence. But in his Bergson's method of intuitive deduction, or whatever you call it, he's saying that he can dissolve those sort of standard categories into something beyond that. Or
Yeah.
I
I think that's right. The key to this is, just as in analytic philosophy, post the linguistic turn, you get all of these approaches to metaphysical problems that say, let's look at the concepts involved, look at their logical grammar or the logical form of sentences that contain them, and then we can see that these problems go away. Bergson, but in a different tradition, is doing something similar by saying that the concept of nothing or nothingness, or what you take to be this concept, is formed in the following way. And when you follow through the formation, you see that the concept it's a mirage. So you can either say, I've got the concept, I do have the concept of nothingness, but it means nothing. Or the better way to say it, I think, is probably that there isn't really a concept, and that I merely seem to be able to think of nothingness. So the whole procedure does involve a story about how you get to have the concept. And somebody could shortcut the whole thing by saying, look, sorry, I'm not going to accept your way of accounting for how concepts are formed. I just have a clear and distinct idea of nothingness, and that allows me to ask the question, why anything? But that would be a kind of dogmatic, rationalist response.
I think what is quite, he just says that the categories that are used are sort of wrong, because he uses this concept of kind, doesn't he, in the sense that I suppose he would say that nothingness and existence are of the same kind. They're implicit in each other.
Yep.
And that is a Bergsonian sort of, he uses those kinds to sort of trace back what it is that is at the base of it.
Good, yeah. So, I mean, is this right? The result actually is very, very, very radical. And you could think, well, we've got the concept of the world existing. It seems to be puzzling, but let's look at the concept of nothingness. We discovered that it's not cogent. And so we shouldn't ask why the world exists. So we just have a world existing. Now, that's not what Bergson does. As you say, he indicates that the concept of nothingness and the concept of being in existence, they're partners in crime. So if you get rid of the concept of nothingness, you've got to modify or give up on the old metaphysical use of the concept of existence. So Parfit's premise, there exists a world and it is thus, that's already pseudo-understanding by Bergson's light. It's not true that there exists a world. Now, he doesn't want to say that all statements that use the word exists are nonsense. So he's got to find a way of analysing them, just as he analyses negative judgments. But that's the second part of his labour. So if he's right, there's no problem about the world existing rather than not existing. And it's not just because there is no such thing as nothingness that can be coherently thought. It's also because the world doesn't exist.
I sort of can say something similar, but because I'm sure, like a lot of people, there are lots of things about this piece that I like a lot. You know, I like the way he writes. For one, very, very fine writer. But one of the things that it seems to me that you are then committed to is this sort of view that what we consider to be realist ontology, the sort of world that we meet every day and all our experiences, is fundamentally unreal. So it's an illusory.
I think he don't have to take it quite. I think he just shifts his reference frame into, because he uses time and space as sort of the fundamental dualism to his whole thinking. So the way I sort of look at it is that, or the way I understood part of it was that time or duration becomes essentially the fabric of the world.
Exactly. Very good.
Existence.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it is. He doesn't show the world to be illusion, or he doesn't take himself to have shown anything like that. And it's not strictly true to say that what we know are mere appearances that have no reality for him. He thinks that the things that we do take to know when we're not doing metaphysics, and when we get it all wrong. Those things do have reality, it's just that reality is provided by intuition and duration and all this stuff. So it's a revisionism.
Yeah, so it's much more, but it's a sort of, okay, so it's not denying the ontology's sort of reality, it's simply saying it's not quite the same kind of thing that if you want to do sort of speculative metaphysics, you can't then apply those same ways of thought.
But what I think is really powerful about the way he argues his whole method is that he engages directly with sort of, I guess, a logical description of whether this typical metaphysical description, and then sort of almost undresses it and brings it into his way of thinking. He doesn't sort of argue from the way up, takes it down to what the fundamental.
Good. Which school or which philosopher in the early modern period, in this regard, just in this regard, is Bergson reminiscent of? Taking metaphysics.
I'm going to have a guess, but kind of like an educated guess, maybe Spinoza.
No. I wouldn't. No,
I've heard him
the other
reference
side.
to Plato, but
sorry, my crystal ball wasn't very good. I'm thinking the other side of the fence. It's the empiricist, Hume. So, I mean, Hume takes the idea of substance, the idea of causality, and shows these to be empty notions. How does he do so? Well, largely by telling us how we come to form what we think to be the idea of secret connection. And then you see that there is no real concept of necessary connection. It's just words. And the metaphysical problem goes away. And you're left with, well, for Hume, you're just left with your impressions and ideas ticking over. And for Bergson, you're left with something a lot more Platonic and substantial. But the deflation is surely reminiscent of Hume and other empiricists. You might even think of Berkeley. What is it? To exist. To exist is to be conceived. There's nothing more to it than that. It's a deflation or a downgrading that makes metaphysical problems go away. Other responses to Bergson's whole procedure. One question being, I suppose, whether this deflation or elimination of nothingness and the deflation of ontological talk, can we be satisfied with this? Put the question back to, so for Bergson, so you read your Bergson and you say, okay, I understand the idea of nothingness is an empty idea, so too then is the idea of existence. So, when I say this Coke bottle exists, Bergson, what am I saying? Because it really does seem to be true. What is his answer to that?
Are you saying it exists only in the sense that it kind of means something to me, as kind of meaning in the world, in the social world, in which it was kind of created?
Yes. Good. Other people?
Well, when he talk about it in terms of duration again, in terms of this temporal understanding of the world, and I guess he would say that its duration is what you're really referring to.
Right.
The fact that it is present for this time, that's all within time.
Right. Good. So again, he's rather like the empiricist. So you've got your judgmental conceptual claim. There is an object. It has various features, and it has the property or the status of being existent. And you think of your experience as leading you to that judgment. Bergson puts the whole thing in reverse. What is it to say that something is an object and exists? It is, and then I can't say what the rest is, because here I have to go back to my temporally extended intuition. So all of our judgments, all of our claims, all of our knowledge claims, they're all really just a superstructure that should point back down to the intuitions that we have. And those intuitions are not ineffable because we can articulate them in judgments. But the truth of the matter is always the intuiting. The intuiting is not the experience through which you get to the truth of things. So, I mean, it is a really weird picture, I think. It's not just saying we have knowledge of the world, metaphysical knowledge, that's silly. Scientific knowledge is good. It's saying we don't, in a way, we don't have knowledge. Our knowledge just is the intuitive presence or our being acquainted with things. That's what knowing is. Does that make any sense? Yeah.
Sorry, does this look a bit like Daniel Dennett's notion of high level of real illusions? You know, how consciousness is a high level way to describe, like it's a metaphor that is useful for a higher level of description, but not for a lower level of description. So like, if we do the parallel, you know, in Dennett's view, consciousness is the metaphor for neurons, just like existence is the metaphor for duration, maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
So the dispute, so whether like question whether it's real or not, is again rendered like it's not. It doesn't operate because it is real.
Yeah.
It's just a real illusion.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I mean, in a way, Dennett and Bergson are obviously opposed because Bergson affirms the reality of consciousness. But in a way, the structures, I agree, are the same. So Dennett also thinks that the propositional expressions of beliefs they're secondary, and they involve various fictions, and we only have language because we have an intentional stance, and we attribute beliefs and desires, and those aren't things that are part of the fabric of reality. So in both of them, there is an idea of a level below judgment and conceptualization that is reality, and that our judgments and conceptualizations reflect in an inadequate and misleading way. So Dennett, I agree, is at the end of the day, he's a revisionist like Bergson. Other thoughts about this? What's the other way of getting rid of the problem that we had earlier was the Wittgensteinian one. That's just saying that unless a proposition refers to a possibility of experience that can in principle be actualized, then the proposition has no meaning. Is that very different from what Bergson is offering? I mean, Wittgenstein doesn't do all of this stuff about duration and intuition, nor did the logical positivists, but there's something in common, isn't there?
Well, the fact that we have in common is that even when we think of annihilation, we think of, if we say not X, we are thinking of the possibility of X, so that's probably the similarity between the two views.
Yes, yeah. And is that, next question then, is that account of negative judgment, is it plausible? Going back to the table is not white and the ground is not wet. Is that a plausible way of thinking about negative judgments?
It seems there's some truth in you know, in fact, it's quite an astute observation, I think, that there is a significant difference between the negation of some X and then the antonym of that X. And actually, one of the things that struck me reading this was there isn't really, and quite sort of perhaps to support his argument in some way, there isn't really a strict antonym for reality. There isn't anything like that. You can say something's unreal, but it doesn't really mean it's not real. It means it's sort of a bit strange or unusual. So, I mean, you can certainly see that this is not just a trivial point about, a sort of idiosyncrasy of languages. It's something quite profound about the way that we think about sort of negation,
Yeah.
especially, I mean, it has, I think if he's right, it has serious ramifications for what logicians think they can do. Say semantics, people trying to work out formal theories of semantics, you know.
Yeah.
If negation isn't really the same thing as
Yes.
the opposite of something, then you're really off to the wrong start from the very beginning, because it's a fundamental, basic component of that sort of program.
So the naive, ordinary way of thinking would be, there are true statements of a negative form, the table is not wide, and they are logically on a par with the table is wide. But on this revised construal, to say that the table is not wide is really to invite an inference, or it's to say there is space for saying something about how the table is currently unoccupied and only falsely occupied by the table is wide. So it's a bit like going back to the social business of judgment. It's saying there's something to be known. So it's kind of pointing, the judgment points forward rather than making a claim that is supposed to stand in correspondence with how things are.
Would it be fair to say from that this is almost like a grand scale of the fallacy of composition, in that, you know, what is true of the parts is not true of the whole? Just as you can have a football team that has great individual players, and is not necessarily a great team. You can have things that are true of, you know, such that you can make unexistent, you can conceptualize it as non-existing as a part. When you do that on the grand scale of existence itself, it's not. It just can't apply in that exact same way.
Yeah. Good. I mean, that's nice. I think judgment is, to the football analogy, it's passing the ball to another player. When you make a negative statement, you're saying you're going from one part of the world to another. So all of the force of judgments is always within the world, from one part of it to another. Judgment can't get the world as a whole. And that does mean, I think, does it not, that there is no such thing as the world?
When you say the world, do you mean existence? Or?
Well, the question is there a whole? If we say that there is a whole, then we're kind of back in, we've got an all that apparently exists in contradistinction to a nothing, and that we've been shown is all pseudo. So we have to give up on there being an all, so we have to give up on the idea of there being a world. So we can think of, in terms of getting from here to there, or filling in this bit, but we can't make sense of the idea of there being a totality.
But even if there is not a totality or a whole, does that differ the question that even if there is something which wouldn't qualify as a totality or as a whole, even if there is something, there's the question, why is it there, would still be there?
Well, I think you could ask different why questions. You could try and resurrect the why anything question. Why should there be a fabric, as it were? Why should it be possible for there to be transition from one part of the world, strike that through, to another? So maybe you could get the same kinds of questions reappearing in a new formulation. But I think the original question would have been disposed of.
That is when you took the whole world as one totality.
Yeah.
That would be disposed of.
That would be disposed of.
But questions like regarding the same theme or the same genre, asking about different parts would still be there.
You could certainly ask about different parts. And so maybe metaphysics would continue through the questions raised by the parts.
But even if there are parts, isn't there, like, even if there is no harmony with the situation of another harmony, then there is a whole again. So even if there is a situation where there are different parts, that would be qualify as a whole, wouldn't it?
Would it?
You could say a whole of parts.
Yeah,
wouldn't we?
I mean, we shouldn't really talk, if we're going to get rid of wholes, then strictly I suppose we've got to get rid of parts or finite elements. We talk about getting from here to there, but we shouldn't be thinking of the here and the there as part of anything bigger than whatever here and there in combination amounts to. Any last thoughts? Yeah.
Is it like considering the world as like a potential something?
know, like the potential and the actual. So there might be like you might see someone as a potential of something, so you're working towards that potential, but it doesn't mean that just because it's not actualised at that moment doesn't mean that it's an idea that couldn't become actualised.
Okay.
And otherwise, if some could say, if you didn't think like that, then would you have goals? Or because when you have goals, you're working towards a potential.
Good. I mean, even if you give up the idea of the totality, the all, you might want to say that there are still possibilities. So there's the possibility that the table could not have been white. So we still have to think about this array, the facts that make up this thing that we used to call the world. It still contrasts with other possible combinations. So we've still got the why question about how that should be. So again, maybe that's a way of resurrecting these kinds of traditional questions against Bergson. But I think he will say the same about possibility. He will say the question, to say that the table could possibly be a different colour from the colour that it is. For him, that's just going to be saying something about, well, what is it talking about? It's referring the table to intuitions that you've had in the past of other tables and noting some disresemblance. So,
sorry, don't let me interrupt. Just to say, possibly Bergson could respond in a sort of Wittgensteinian spirit and say that, well, the world is in the everyday sense, the common parlance sense, is still a functional concept. The world isn't, sort of scientific materialist types would have you believe it's not just a collection of atoms. The world is the thing in which we subsist. So if we're subsisting in the sense of on the ontology of experience, the sort of active ontology, then of course there's still a world. The world is just the thing in which we do these things. Okay,
right,
if we're looking at this lower level, then that's not really there, sure, but we don't need to worry about, suddenly having to remove this word that we use.
No, but we can carry on using it in a local way, in an unpretentious, non-metaphysical way. Sure, that's fine, that's licensed.
I'm just trying to figure out where exactly this paper stands in regards to parfits. And would I be right in thinking that the nothingness that we can't quite get a foothold on is kind of the same as the metaphysical absolute?
Yes, it is. So Bergson is right. Parfit was in the grip of a misconception.
Is going the opposite way. We were talking about kind of the process of abduction that he uses, which essentially is trying to superimpose things from our world and ideas from our world on the cosmic level.
Exactly.
And then you reach ideas like, God or physics with, under a bad conception, where I think you're actually saying something about real things and therefore trying to explain our world, the wrong way or something. I think that's what I understood it as.
Yeah, good. So if Bergson is right, Parfit is misguided, and if Parfit's question is good, then something must have gone wrong in Bergson's dissolution of the problems into pseudo-problems. Okay, well, this topic, in a way, will come back with the principle of sufficient reason in 2 weeks' time, which I think is yours, so we'll have another chance to think about the whole or the all of things. Good, okay, thank you very much.